Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 11. This is a chapter on the Mongols, one of the last real nomadic peoples that disrupt settled societies. This is the very beginning of the early modern period, or maybe we can even look at it as the beginning of the end of the medieval period. Well, without further ado, for the Horde! Now, the Mongols themselves are one of many different tribes that live in the central plateau steppe region of Central Asia. Most of the land is very marginal. It doesn't have many forests, few water sources. It is subject to temperature extremes, much in the same way that the Arabian Peninsula is subject to those extremes, like we covered last week. So there's not a lot of opportunity to settle a successful settled society. Thus, the Mongols, as well as the Tartars, the Merkits, the Turks, and several other groups, including originally the Huns, um, they are part of a nomadic or at least semi-nomadic society that prizes um, uh, very skilled horsemanship and the ability to interact both violently and non-violently with other societies. Now, the Mongols were really very close to collapsing one of the strong dynasties of China in the 12th centuries. But the Jin dynasty was able to not only defeat the grandfather of somebody who would be known as Genghis Khan, a man named Temujin. They defeated his grandfather, but just barely. And the government decided that it was in their best interest to, since they couldn't defeat the Mongols, and if the Mongols came back, it would be very likely that they would lose. So the Chinese government started interfering in politics of the Central Asian steppes. And this is the way that it happened. They would look at a tribe that was kind of on the down and outs. They would look at, say, the Merkits, and they would say, "Ooh, you guys are really hurting. You know, we're going to help you. We're going to give you money. We're going to give you horses. We're going to give you weapons. We're going to give you training. We're going to give you food, whatever you need, intelligence, you name it." And then the Merkits would start getting very powerful, and they would start beating up the other nomadic tribes, so like the Mongols or the Tatars or whatever like that. And then when the Merkits got really big and got close to threatening the balance of power, or the unbalance of power, if you will, the Chinese would then go, say, approach, let's say, the Tatars, who were now on the low end of the totem pole, and they would do the same thing. And they kept messing with these different tribes, and they began to foster these wars, these almost unending wars between the tribes. And it is a policy of divide and disrupt that is similar to divide and conquer. The Chinese knew they couldn't conquer because if the Chinese came in with an army, all those nomadic tribes would unite against them, and so that's a no-win situation. So a divide and keep them disrupted policy. Um, the tribes were so busy fighting each other, which, to be fair, they loved fighting each other just as much as they loved fighting others. So this policy worked for about a century. It worked fairly well. Into this mix, we have a young man, a little boy, whose father was betrayed by a rival tribe and was poisoned. It was um, this breach of nomadic etiquette that, you know, if you find yourself at an oases are, or places of water, are essentially neutral ground in Mongol or nomadic Central Asian societies. They're kind of, no fighting near the water because we don't want to spoil the water. But he was betrayed and killed, and this leads to a series of unfortunate events for Temujin. Now, Temujin was very, very young. He was not as tall as the axle of a cart. So he's maybe 2.5 feet tall, 3 feet tall, maybe. And because of that, he was spared. The rest of his family was put to the sword and killed. So he, his mother, and his younger brother are cast out of their tribal support network. They're no longer the important family. They go from riches to rags. And during that time, he lives as an outcast, and his mother uh, schools him on the real politics. I mean, how to cultivate allies, how to make bargains, how to deal with people who are powerful when you are not. And so he starts to see some of the harsh realities of tribal life. He sees these blood feuds, which are endless. That similar blood feud that we talked about last week when we talked about the Bedouins. He saw thievery, corruption, and on top of it all, the hand of the Chinese kind of guiding it all, kind of stirring the pot, keeping the waters muddied, and that sort of thing. Well, he eventually he was taken as a slave as a young child. He eventually escapes because there was a man who was very sympathetic to his plight and knew that the boy was going to be killed when he reached a certain height. He would have been about 9 when he would have been executed rather. And so the man helps him escape, and then the boy falls in with another tribe who adopts him. And luckily, the person who adopts him is the head of this small clan. And so he gets these protections. So he learns the formal things of war. He learns the formal ways of waging war. He also makes very familial connections. He then capitalizes upon this, and to cut a very long story, it's a very dramatic and interesting story. If you ever get the chance to see the movie Mongol, which came out maybe a few years ago, about maybe 6 years ago, I think, 7 years ago, that is a fair representation, although there are some flights of fancy in there, some things that are mythological. That is a fair representation of how he grew up. So eventually he does lead a band of his own. And he begins to build these alliances, and he begins to alter the rules of war and the rules for loyalty. For example, there was a rival chief that he was hunting down for various reasons. And so his group had beaten this rival chief, and the rival chief and a few of his closest warriors run away. And so Temujin chases after him and relentlessly chases after him, slowly nipping away and whittling away the warriors that are around him. And so the rival leader eventually is murdered or betrayed and murdered by the soldiers who had sworn loyalty to him, had sworn fealty to him. And they bring the body to Temujin, hoping that they would receive mercy from him and that they would be able to join his horde and be successful and be accepted and not be in danger. He orders these soldiers executed because they had sworn loyalty to their lord. And your word is, if you can't rely on a nomad's word, there's nothing you can rely on. Because if they were willing to betray him, this defeated lord, then they would definitely betray Temujin. He has some very harsh penalties, especially for traitors, people who offend the sense of honor. But they also have harsh penalties for people who cheat or who uh, try to scam people out of you know life savings or scam people out of a trade deal or things like that. Eventually, he does unify most of the Mongol tribes and most of the Tartars, and then he runs into trouble with the Chinese army, making an alliance with the Tatars and a few of the Merkits, a few of the other tribes that are running around. And this temporarily disrupts Temujin's plans because he thought, all I need is brute strength. That's all I need. Much like many of um, the warriors of the time, and even into the 20th century, the idea of using espionage was seen as low and sneaky and dishonorable and that sort of thing. But it was this very lack of intelligence that led Temujin to a defeat, a temporary setback. It was still a stinging defeat, but it was a temporary setback, and he learned from it. And so he cultivated spy networks. Um, a lot of the trade that came from Asia into Europe along the Silk Road passed through Mongol territory. So it was an easy task to kind of fold his own spies into some of these traders. Now, there were some merchants who traded with the Mongols who were of Mongol descent that had already existed. He just kind of tapped into that. He also tapped into some criminal networks to get some ideas of where uh, armies were moving, who was going where, what kind of deals were in place. And so this helps him understand his rivals and helps him undo a lot of plots and schemes both within the Mongol society and against Mongol society. So he becomes a very wily, very shrewd leader. He also begins to adapt new technologies. A good example of this is when assaulting Chinese cities. Chinese cities, especially in the north, were walled cities, and they were difficult to get over. Uh, Eventually, he begins to adopt siege warfare and siege tactics. So, giant towers to giant protected towers to scale the walls, using catapults to break down the walls, that sort of thing. They even engage in some biological warfare by launching dead bodies over the walls. And of course, if anybody's ever seen a carcass fall from any particular height with any kind of velocity, it tends to spatter and spray things, and bits and pieces go everywhere. So that's a good way to start spreading disease, which is one of the reasons why we have the Black Plague sweep through Europe. That was one of the things that happened as a side effect of this kind of early biological warfare. So Temujin's spy network makes him strong externally. His military also makes him strong externally. He also builds up some very robust alliances within his society, and it allows him to conquer the Mongol steppes by about 1203. So he's got a lock, relatively young, on a region that was initially very disunified and one that had been used to being at war, much like Muhammad had unified the Arabian Peninsula. Uh, Very, very similar, very close parallels, except he's not, Genghis Khan is not a religious figure. Genghis Khan, also known as Chinggis Khan, literally is a title meaning the widespread, just, and powerful king. That's what Chinggis means. Widespread, just, overarching, eternal, powerful, that sort of thing. And Khan means king. We just refer to it as the Great King. Now, he is an interesting study, and we'll get to a little bit of his society after we talk about his conquest, but he's far more complex than just a wily, crafty military leader and politician. So in 1206, his empire looks something like on the left there. So the early Mongol Empire has chunks of modern-day Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China that are part of his territory. They utilize some very crafty and ingenious technology to assist in their conquests, to help spread these Mongol holdings. And one of the ways that they do this is through the use of hit and run tactics, this mounted warfare. Uh, that is augmented with an incredibly strong bow, the composite bow. On the inside, if we look at the bow that we have pictured here, on the inside, the inner part of the bow is lined with animal horn. And animal horn is made from the same material that your fingernails are. So it's a little bendy, a little squishy. It can compress a little bit. And so that when something compresses it, it springs back, it pushes back. So it's a pushing spring. On the outside, on the front end of the bow was strung with sinew. So there were layers of sinew on the front. All of this is laminated onto a very thin wood, sometimes bamboo core. So you've got a little bit of wood, and you have horn on the inside, and you have sinew on the outside. And sinew is like a rubber band. And so when you stretch it, it'll stretch, but when you let go, it's going to snap back. So you've got two springs. You've got a pushy spring and a pulley spring, right? And this helps the arrows launch way, way further than most bows of that size in that era. To give you an idea, the bow's effective range was somewhere between 250 to about 500 meters. To give you an idea, that's 1,500 feet. That is 5 football fields long. Well, longer than 5 football fields. It's actually closer to 1,600 feet. So this is on par with modern rifles. So they're able to shoot fairly far. Now, are they going to shoot with great accuracy at that distance? No, not really. That's part of the mechanics is that there's varying winds, varying conditions that will affect the bow's accuracy. However, launching a bunch of arrows from 5 football fields away and then suddenly sweeping out of the way so that your enemy can't answer your archers is a very effective and disconcerting tactic because the opposing army keeps losing enemies, but your army is relatively intact. And so this leads to demoralization on the enemy side. And as I mentioned before, they adopted siege warfare and they applied biological warfare, throwing diseased and dead bodies over the walls. One of the methods that the Mongols really kind of perfected was this psychological warfare. Often, what would happen is cities would defy the Mongols. They wouldn't surrender to the Mongols. So the Mongols would kill every man, woman, child, dog, cat, cow, sheep, chicken, you name it, that was in the city. Absolutely everything. In fact, during the Mongol conquests, we can tell now that the net carbon dioxide in the atmosphere went down by about 500 million. Can't remember the exact. It's parts per million, 500 parts per million, something like that, 500,000 parts per million, or I can't remember the exact number. But we're able to tell because we take core samples of the ice core and also tree rings. We can tell that they had around the world, trees had a really great time during the Mongol conquest because there were a lot less people. And there were a lot less people breathing, and so there was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere. So the Mongols, especially Genghis Khan, were really open to a lot of philosophies. They had been exposed to a bunch of different religious theories and religious beliefs. Buddhism, for example, but also Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity, Islam, and even Judaism. Yes, there were Jewish Mongols. I swear to God, this is a thing. Okay, so we have a bunch of these competing ideologies, at least these competing messages of how to find salvation. The Mongols didn't particularly care. They didn't become, say, dyed-in-the-wool Buddhists and became intolerant. In fact, they tolerated all philosophies and all religions because they didn't know whether one god or another god was the more powerful. So they wanted to make sure that they didn't anger any of these gods. And so they allowed all religions to practice freely and to convert freely. And there was an edict forbidding any kind of religious strife within Mongol society. So it's actually pretty amazing that they were so bloodthirsty and yet so willing to accept the idea of Jesus Christ or of Islam without any kind of fight, without any kind of combat in between them. And as I mentioned before about the psychological warfare, sometimes they would attack those cities and they would take the heads of those people in those cities and they would go to the next city and they would say, they would send in, say, priests or monks or somebody like that to negotiate, say, hey, uh, surrender or this will happen to you. And of course, the monks are escorting like piles of skulls. Or if the city wouldn't let the emissary in, the Mongols would launch the skulls over the walls so that people would be peppered with raining heads. So very easily you get the message very quickly that there was a bigger city upstream or maybe in the next county that was completely wiped out. What the hell are we defying these guys for? And if you didn't defy them, if you surrendered to them, you were fine. You just had to pay a little bit of a tax and you were left alone. That was it. So, yeah, if you're going to be conquering the world, why not? So, another interesting aspect of Genghis Khan's society that I think speaks to uh, a lot of the questions we've been wrestling with is the sense of injustice, the sense of what is the purpose of a society? Are we here to serve the gods? Are we here to serve rich people? Are we here to be stuck, mired in misery? Well, Genghis Khan's childhood was marked by poverty, slavery, and violence. And so a lot of the laws that were passed in the Mongol Empire were aimed at tackling some of these crippling injustices, things that Genghis Khan himself experienced and that he didn't want the rest of his society to experience. For example, he broke a tradition wherein when a Mongol chieftain sends his warriors out to raid, say, a Chinese settlement or an Indian settlement or a Siberian settlement, that they would rape, pillage, plunder. All the plunder would come back. It would be given to the chief, who may or may not have participated in the raid, and then the chief would piecemeal out these different trinkets and these different prizes so that you would have the most favored warriors, even if they didn't do the most work, would get the most treasure. And, so then it left a lot of people on the fringes who were not taken care of. You have beggars, you have the crippled, you have the old, you have the people who are despised, who are outcast, like Temujin himself. He was despised and outcast because his father had died. So he changed that to a kind of welfare where if there was any money taken, whether through taxes, through trade, or through conquest, it was distributed evenly amongst all families, not just the lords. So that if you raided a city and got, let's pick a number, 100,000 uh, gold pieces, and instead of it going to the lords and the lords deciding how this would be doled out, it was doled out evenly. He also took pains to hire scribes, particularly Confucian scholars, to keep track of all the food that was available within his society. So all grains, all vegetables, all meats, milks, whatever, as well as to keep track and kind of institute a census, a very Chinese kind of census, as to the level standard of living that each of his followers had, each of his people had. And so he would match the need for shelter, the need for food with the means that the person had. So if, for instance, they were a tradesman, they probably wouldn't get very much in the way of assistance for food or assistance for shelter. Because if they're a blacksmith or they're a saddle maker or whatever, they're probably doing fairly well. Maybe they're not, maybe they are. But if they're a beggar or if they're blind or if they're old or if they've been maimed or crippled in a war, then of course their need is higher and their ability to provide for themselves is much lower. He also made the poor exempt from taxes. So there was a minimum threshold to have a standard of living before you started paying taxes. He also, as I mentioned before, he had freedom of religion, and he promoted a meritocracy so that if somebody was a very good warrior, if somebody worked really hard, they could rise up the ranks, not just in the army or the military, but also within his government or within his society. He also promoted trade. He believed that trade was important. In fact, not just important, it was vital to the prolonged success of his people. So as much as his armies went out and fought and conquered, his merchants went out and traded in spices and silks, luxury items, ivory, gems, gold, you name it. They traded in everything. Now, of course, the Mongols have a very bloodthirsty reputation, and perhaps that information that I imparted to you is a little bit of a surprise, this idea of this compassion. But Mongols have a very pragmatic approach to life and death. They know life is brutal. They also know war is brutal. They just accept it. Now, does that mean there are people who suffer from PTSD? Absolutely, there are. But if they start lashing out, they don't act like that person is defective. They understand that life is brutal. And so they take pains to try to help end that person's internal struggle. Uh, that being said, they were also very willing to use their reputation as bloodthirsty, brutal uh, army to kind of intimidate others into surrendering, as I mentioned before, the lobbing of heads over the walls. They would also use captured populations as human shields. They would say they were besieging a city and they would have farmers and others that they had captured standing in front of the army so that when the city that is defending itself fired back, they would kill their own citizens first. So they basically became cannon fodder, if you will. They would also give ultimatums. They would send messengers ahead of their conquest, say, "Hey, surrender or bad things will happen to you." And this is a there's a story when we get to the Middle East of this happening, and you can see both sides. On the one hand, you can see why people would want to resist the Mongols and think, well, hey, we can beat the Mongols, and you can also see why they should surrender to the Mongols at the same time. So by the time that uh, Chinggis Khan is in his 50s, he's got 100,000 strong army, which is huge. Part of it is actual Mongols, loyalists, who are the core of his army, but he also hires mercenaries. They are very quick to hire mercenaries because, again, it's cheaper than having to raise your own warriors. And if people are willing to fight for gold, as long as you're paying them, hey, that's great. They'll stay loyal. Now, the Chinese, of course, were the first victims of the Mongol expansion. The Genghis Khan saw this as revenge for all the interference that eventually led to his father's death and inflicted a bunch of misery on himself personally. And also, China was kind of the typical or this, the traditional enemy of the Mongols. The Yuan dynasty, which had succeeded the Jin dynasty, was uh, based upon Chinese culture, but it was Mongol. In fact, the Jin dynasty and then later the Song dynasty, which had succeeded the Jin dynasty, were collapsed by these Mongol invasions. So the Mongols set up this new kind of outsider dynasty, and they use a lot of the rules and a lot of the history of China against it. For example, the Chinggis Khan claims that the mandate of heaven made it easy for him to invade and conquer China. So he was using this idea, this concept of the mandate of heaven against the Chinese. And while he's busy attacking and conquering China, he's also busy sending out merchants to India and to the Middle East, trading in what they have. Well, there's an empire in modern day Persia, Afghanistan, and some of the uh, stands in southern Russia, northern Central Asia, like Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and that sort of place. And it's called the Khwarizmid Empire, and it's actually fairly affluent. It sits on a large swath of the Silk Road, and so it's got a lot of wealth. It also has a very large army. In fact, the army that the Khwarezmid Empire is able to field is about twice as many soldiers as the Mongol Empire has total. So the prospect of trading with the Khwarezmid Empire is very lucrative. It's a very appealing prospect. And so the Mongols send merchants and deputations, trade deputations to the Khwarezmid Empire, and the Khwarezmid Empire steals the goods. They basically rob this Mongol train of merchants, this caravan. And they say, well, the Mongols are thieves. They stole this stuff from other people, and so they should not profit on this trade that they have. And that was partly true. Some of the goods that they were trading were from conquered territories, and that's how you get more money, right? Well, Genghis Khan initially was insulted, but he also said, you got a fair point. So they send a trade deputation again. This time they send a diplomatic envoy as well. And the diplomat shows up in the Khwarezmid Empire, and the Khwarezmid society or the Khwarezmid leadership decides that they're going to kill the uh, the trade deputation, and they're going to embarrass the diplomat. The story goes that they ripped his beard out. They grabbed his beard and pulled it off of his face. Now, anybody who has facial hair would tell you, A, that stuff is attached, right? And so pulling it off would probably pull off a whole lot of skin, right? So it was an extremely excruciating. It is far more likely, far, far, far more likely that they forcefully shaved him without any kind of like prep, which of course would also cause layers of skin to come off, but it probably wouldn't be deadly. And they sent him packing with a sign that said "thief" on his chest, sent him packing back to the Mongol dynasty. And so, in the middle of conquering the Song dynasty, Genghis Khan pauses and says, "Okay, I cannot let this insult go unanswered." And so he sends a letter to uh, the the Shah of the Khwarezmid Empire, and says, "The disaster is upon you." That's all he says. Now there's a massive desert separating the Khwarezmid Empire and the Mongol Empire. And so the Khwarezmid are like, well, there's only a few roads that they could possibly take, so we will watch those roads, and we will have advance notice, very well in advance notice, of the approach of the Mongol army. Well, the Mongols had been cultivating spies, as I mentioned before, and one of the spies, or several of the spies that they cultivated, were smugglers. And smugglers showed the Mongol Empire a kind of secret route through the desert that bypassed a lot of the main roads. And so the Mongols were able to surprise the Khwarezmid Empire's army and crush it. They then chased down the governor of the province that had stolen the caravan's money and embarrassed the or shamed, I should say, the diplomat, and poured molten silver in his eyes and ears to kill him. So if you ever watch Game of Thrones, especially the first season, and you see somebody die by having molten gold poured on them, that actually could have happened, right? That actually is a plausible method of killing somebody, um, just to give you an idea. The Mongols then expand eastward. They begin to conquer. They conquer the Khwarezmid Empire. They go on to conquer the Caliphate. They end the Abbasid Caliphate. They take Baghdad, and they put the caliph in a sack. The caliph had been claiming that his blood was sacred, sacred to God, sacred in Islam, and so they put him in a sack and trample him to death so that none of his blood is spilled on the ground and thus defiling and angering God. I mean, they have very weird rules for getting around some of these things. And the Mongol conquests actually wind up killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people across Eurasia. Ah, there we are. There's the number that I was talking about. So he may be the first green conqueror. I mean, if we're being a little a little facetious here, his conquests drop the CO2 levels by 700 million tons of CO2. So that's how few people survive the Mongol conquest after he starts heading eastward. New territories bring new nationalities. These new nationalities bring even deeper cultural mixing, but they also present their own troubles. Before his death, Genghis Khan presides over one of the largest land empires ever known, period. And so there's the question of um, communication. How do you keep faraway provinces from rising up and throwing off Mongol rule once the Mongols themselves have moved on to other territories or had to put something down, put a rebellion down somewhere else? Well, the answer is an early Pony Express. There were regularly stationed horse posts where a messenger who had a golden seal, it was literally solid gold. It weighed about 5 pounds. You wore it on the outside of your belt. The reason why you wore gold is, first off, it was to display the wealth, but also because it shines in the sunlight. So anybody seen riding across the Mongol steppes with something glimmering on their belt, you leave them the hell alone. And this protection, this Mongol protection, extended to merchant bands as well, and traders and explorers. People like Marco Polo were afforded the golden seal that allowed him free passage throughout the Mongol Empire. And this became known as Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace. And if you violated, or if you were found to violate the sanctity of having one of those passes, let's say you interfered with a pony rider who was bringing a message from one of the far-flung provinces, uh, they would eventually find out who you were. And when they found out who you were, they would not only kill you, they would kill your family, they would kill everybody who knew your family. They would literally wipe you and maybe even the city or town that you were hiding in off the map. In fact, a lot of the cities that were destroyed during the Mongol invasions in the early 13th century are still not populated today. Their destruction was that thorough. Eventually, however, Genghis Khan does die, but his descendants go on to continue to expand his empire. And this is the apex of the Mongol Empire at the end of the 13th century. It encompasses the vast majority of China, as well as the Middle East, Siberia, and there were even pushes into Europe and the Middle East. One of the things that prevented an invasion into India was the difficulty of getting over the Hindu Kush mountains in Afghanistan and getting over the Himalayas in Tibet and Nepal. Now, Genghis Khan died in 1227, so the empire continues to expand after his death, and they hold on to a lot of his rules. He leaves his empire in communal trust for his entire family as well as some close friends. His son Ogadai becomes an undisputed ruler at first. He's the oldest son. At first, he's undisputed. But eventually, the death of Ogadai, his son, brings a kind of struggle for power. The empire kind of begins to break up a little bit. The empire is divided into bits and pieces, little what are we called khanates. They're almost like think of them as states. There's about 6 or 7 states that are established after the death of Ogadai. One of which you may have heard of, the Great Khanate ruled by Kublai Khan, the head of the Yuan dynasty in China. But there's also the Eastern Khanate, the Il Khanate, run by a man named Hulagu Khan. Um, Give you an idea of what these different Khanates look like. You have the Chagatai Khanate, which is closer to the Central Asian Khanate. You have the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which rules large parts of Russia and actually conquered Moscow a couple of times. Didn't really hold on to the territory, but just projecting their strength there. Um, the Ilkhanate, which runs most of uh, Persia and Iraq, Syria, and bits and pieces of Anatolia. You also have the Great Khanate that eventually is unified by Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan attempts to invade. He successfully invades Korea and twice attempts to invade Japan, only to be turned back by some storms, some very big hurricanes, which winds up becoming more mythological in Japanese society. Now, the Pax Mongolica allows, as I mentioned before, for explorers. And we talked about one of the explorers last time, and we kind of touched on uh, um, Ibn Battuta, this young African who was born in Morocco and then spent the next 25 years wandering the earth. Part of the reason why he was able to do that is because of his Muslim faith connected him to other Muslims throughout the world. And one of the reasons why there are other Muslims around the world is because of the Mongol expansion and the Mongol Pax Mongolica that allowed the spread of a lot of these religions. But also Marco Polo. Marco Polo and his family leave Italy about 1260, and this begins again another quarter century kind of odyssey for him, and his uncles, and his two uncles and a father who go with him. And uh, Marco Polo meets eventually Kublai Khan, the emperor of China, who then kind of gives him an invitation he can't refuse. So the Polo family wind up spending a good long time in China as semi-official functionaries. And he tries to introduce a lot of innovations from China to Europe, some of which are mythological. For example, you may have heard that Marco Polo introduces pasta to Italy. That's not true. Actually, pasta had been around for a while before Marco Polo even left Venice. But, he does bring back some very accurate maps of Asia. He brings back some somewhat accurate uh, tales of what those societies are like. He introduces the idea of coal, the use of coal. Most Europeans, when whether they're forging iron or smelting something, they used charcoal, which is essentially wood that has had a lot of the moisture heated out of it, and it's mostly carbon. Well, coal is even more efficient than charcoal is. They are two separate things. And also herbology, the idea of using these different herbs to cure illnesses, acupuncture, and even the at the time, and even for a while after, the ridiculous concept of paper money rather than carrying around coins, which tend to be heavy and can be adulterated and that sort of thing, that you have a central bank that issues these notes, these paper notes that are worth money. It is a medium of exchange. That, of course, doesn't catch on in Europe, nor does acupuncture. The Mongol conquest essentially crushed everybody who opposed them, whether it's the Khwarezmid Empire, the Seljuk Turks, the Russians, the Chinese, and they were only stopped in two instances, and mostly due to circumstances. Now, there's a battle that you'll read about in your book called Anjalut, which you probably should have read about last week, which is in Syria, which allows a Muslim army to defeat a kind of smallish Mongol horde. It was really kind of a rump army. It didn't have very many men in it. It didn't have a lot of logistics. It didn't have the full weight of the Mongol Empire, and that's because Hulagu Khan came back because went eastward. He went back to Mongolia because of a power struggle between the different khanates. And then, of course, there's the invasion of Japan in 1274 and 1280 of the current era, where Kublai Khan attempted to invade Japan and was stopped both times by massive hurricanes, or actually typhoons. Typhoons that sunk his fleets and killed a bunch of his men. And if you've been paying attention to the hurricane that just hit Puerto Rico, you can understand just how destructive hurricanes really are. There's always some knucklehead on TV who says, I'm going to ride out the storm and, whatever, I'll be fine. I've lived through it. It's not the wind and the rain. It's the stuff that gets thrown by the wind and the rain. It's the surging tide. It's the trees that get broken, the bits and pieces of your house that get ripped off, or your house that gets collapsed completely. That'll kill you. So both times, the invasion was turned back with the luck of the gods. It becomes a kind of symbol for the Japanese people, these holy winds, these divine winds that were brought up by the gods, these typhoons. They were named kamikaze, and kamikaze becomes kind of a touchstone, a cultural touchstone for the Japanese for the next 600, 700 years, for about the next 700 years, and that becomes the last threat to Japan's sovereignty for the next 500 years. It's not until the Americans show up in the mid 19th century that there is a serious threat of invasion. So the Mongols are, although effective, are not invincible. The Mongols leave behind a new world, or at the very least, a new world order. There are power shifts in Russia that shifts the central power base away from Kiev and back towards Moscow, a more traditional center of power. This also allows for the rise of the Romanov Tsars, who would eventually rule Russia until about 1917, although the Tsars haven't quite emerged just yet, but the groundwork is laid. The Europeans become more aware of Asia like never before. There are more trade and maps, particularly Marco Polo's travels become widely published and popular. In fact, it is Marco Polo's descriptions of Asia that inspire Christopher Columbus to attempt that westward voyage. The Black Death also sweeps along trade routes and disrupts Europe in particular, and the world in general. Up to about a half of Europeans will die in the plagues that are brought about because of the Mongol conquests. As I mentioned before, the Mongols were not afraid to use early biological warfare. The Japanese victory on the other end of the continent sets up a short-lived imperial period, but then settles into a familiar feudal Japanese system that we would be familiar with, shoguns, samurais, and all of that sort of fun stuff. The dissolution of the imperial power basically sidelines the emperor until he reasserts his authority well into the modern period in the 1850s. The Seljuk Ottomans, the Seljuk Turks clear the way for the Ottomans as they were the ones who absorbed the brunt of the Mongol assault, leaving them relatively weakened. And the Ottoman Turks seize that opportunity to begin consolidating power. And when they consolidate that power, they establish an empire that lasts until 1917. Although some would argue it still kind of goes on today in the modern Turkish state. So essentially, the Ottomans create a successor empire. And this sets up our discussions about the early modern period or the end of the feudal period. So the Mongols have a long-lasting legacy, particularly their devastation. All right, guys, that is it for this week. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you again next week.